Welcome to another episode of Stories by Grandma. Clark McKinley Garber was born June 22, 1891 in Worthington, Ohio, the son of Jacob Silas and Maria Swank Garber. He attended Butler Public Schools, from which he graduated in the class of 1910. Then, after 2 years of employment in the capacity of draftsman at the Ideal Electric Company in Mansfield, he studied at Wittenberg College, where he graduated in 1916 with a bachelor's degree in science. Thereafter, he accepted a position as head of the Natural Science Department at the Capital University. But after 8 years there, another change in position was in the making. Clark had read about the government services for natives in Alaska, and in 1924 he made application for a position in that service. In the meantime, he had disposed of his household goods and started working on a journey to the West Coast. Mr. Garber was appointed by the United States government to an Alaskan post in 1925 in the capacity of Superintendent of Eskimo Education, Medical Relief, and Reindeer Herds, over an area of about 4 times the size of Ohio. Accompanied by his wife Madge and 5-year-old son Clark Jr., they settled on Cape Prince of Wales, Bering Strait, in a village of 150 natives. From the front window of their first cabin, the Garbers could see the outline of the Siberian coast 50 miles away, and from which natives came in their small boats to trade. Midway in Bering Strait, between Siberia and Alaska, they could see the Big and Little Diomede Islands, the former belonging to Russia, the latter 1 mile away belonged to the United States. Between them runs the international date line. The living conditions in such a home are an experience that leaves much to be desired. He even professed to a fondness for frozen fish and reindeer meat, both uncooked. Mr. Garber had charge of 42 schools, 9 of which he established. Every year he traveled several thousand miles by dogsled and in midsummer by canoe, visiting the various villages under his supervision. It was not unusual to enter a village where the inhabitants had never seen a white man. Had he been unable to speak their language, the situation would have been difficult indeed. He had many other settlements under his supervision where there were no schools, but which he had to visit periodically to supply medical aid and render assistance, among many other lines. The natives looked forward to the visit of Stanek, which is Eskimo for Big Chief. The final settlement of many a dispute was postponed until he arrived to make the decision. It was not unusual for the superintendent to be away from home 4 or 5 months at a time, with no way of communicating with his wife and son. During these absences, Mrs. Garber and young Clark lived alone among the Eskimo friends. Madge taught the village school, and her son was one of her pupils. With snow covering the ground, there is little to distinguish one part of that vast country from another. Even the villages at such times were almost obliterated, and one almost had to stumble upon them. Mr. Garber, having a fair idea where the next village was located, set a compass course and navigated, so to speak, by that. "I considered wandering far from my course," he said, "but if I did, my dogs would always scent out the village and take me there in a hurry." But scenting out a village was not an accomplishment of the dogs alone. Mr. Garber said he could detect one almost as quickly as his 4-footed charges, especially if they were traveling upwind and at such times as the inhabitants might be indulging in titmook, which in the English language is rotten fish. The first time he saw them eating the stuff, he got ready to treat the entire village for ptomaine poisoning, but he never had a case of it in the 8 years he was among them. Getting lost was not a wholly unknown experience, however. One beautiful cloudless morning, he left one village on his way to another. The sun shone so brightly he did not bother to set a compass course. But after 2 hours of travel, he found himself in a blinding snowstorm. The trail was gone, so he did like he had done before under like circumstances. He let Jerry, his lead dog, find the nearest village. Hour after hour they struggled along. Man and dogs alike were weary. Finally their lagging pace quickened, and soon they were in a village. Then he discovered that after 14 hours of travel, covering 40 miles through a blizzard, they were back in the village they had left that morning. Sometimes a blizzard would become so intense that it was impossible to travel. In such cases, a decision was made on the spot. The driver crawled into his lined sled bag and lay down beside the sled, while the dog, still harnessed and curled up, went to sleep. When the storm subsided, man and dog would dig out from a cover of snow. All would partake of a frozen fish and be on their way. There are many rivers, and at times crossing the ice is dangerous. An unsuspecting river may suddenly engulf the entire outfit. Dry clothing and other supplies were always carried in waterproof covering and securely fastened to the sled. But obviously it takes a great deal of fortitude to change clothes in a temperature of 40 degrees below zero with a stiff blowing wind. But it was either change or freeze to death. The dogs dried themselves by vigorously shaking. The neat little snow houses, igloos, that many of us picture as Eskimo homes are simply non-existent. In an emergency, the natives may build a temporary shelter of snow and ice if he is away from village. But at home, he lives in a dugout called an innie, a dark, little, filthy underground room with a skylight made of seal gut. Usually, the men of any village have a community workshop or a gathering place where they do whatever inside work they have on hand. This place is called a kosiji, and it was here that Mr. Garber gathered most of his folk tales he had so interestingly compiled in his book. While the younger men were busy in the workshops, the old men entertained with their storytelling. Doubtless they had heard the tales hundreds of times, but they always showed a great interest in them. Of great importance to the Garber family was their monthly arrival of the mail, brought in by dog team. But the highlight of the year was the supply boat from Seattle, bringing in the necessities to carry them through the next 12 months. The order is made out with a great deal of calculating, 5 months beforehand. Not only was food ordered, but everything else that must be needed. It was recalled that in making out their first order, the Garbers miscalculated a very important matter of food. Doubtless they had not taken into consideration the hearty appetites that come from living in the Northland. At any rate, they had to live on beans and rice for 3 months, with an occasional fish for variety until their supply ship came again. The long days as well as the long nights were a bit disconcerting at first. With 24 hours of daylight, they were apt to get interested in something only to discover it was 3 o'clock in the morning. But a good old alarm clock finally solved the problem. Reversing the usual order of things, they set the alarm to warn them when it was time to go to bed. The Eskimo has no worries about such matters. When he is hungry, he eats. When tired, he sleeps. Before going to bed, they always put a pencil mark through the particular date on the calendar. If they had not stuck to that rule, very easy matter to lose all track of time. The Eskimo love to visit and entertain. One village may invite all the inhabitants of another village. The visitors set out, sometimes with as many as 50 dog teams traveling 50 or 60 miles. For entertainment, plays were worked out in pantomime, and so well were they done that the spectators easily followed the meaning. These plays usually portrayed the native legends, and they were very much assistance to Clark in his quest for folk tales. This wholesome entertainment went on merrily until every bit of food was gone, after which the guests departed for home. A prized delicacy among these people, and one that might indeed be the original Eskimo pie, was made by mixing blueberries with reindeer fat and seal oil, then beating the mess until it is frothy. Eskimo boys are natural-born scouts. He was able to accomplish more through scouting than by ordinary teaching. They might hike 8 or 10 miles in weather registering 30 below, build a fire, and have a feast of roasted reindeer meat, then hike home again with only a few frozen cheeks and ears as souvenirs of the trip. but everybody would have a grand time. It seems the Eskimo, trained in a region where the basic law is the survival of the fittest, has no respect for his elders. For instance, a half a dozen husky men may sit idly by and watch a frail old female member of the family carry water or perform some other arduous task, with never a thought of helping her. Neither does it occur to her that they should assist her. But when the scoutmaster has instilled in the boys this important feature of doing helpful deeds, they took to it readily enough. Their elders, however, could not understand it. After his return to Ohio from Alaska, Mr. Garber lectured about life in Alaska and the northern region. His lectures were highly rated and enjoyed by many. This kept him away from home for long periods of time, traveling from lecture to lecture. He eventually returned home and returned to the field of teaching. He taught for 20 years in the Butler, Belleville, and Sulphur Springs high schools until his retirement. Clark McKinley Garber died the 1st of April, 1971 in Mansfield, Ohio, at the age of 79 years. He is buried in the Zion Cemetery in Butler, Ohio. He was my fourth cousin, one time removed. This story came from the autobiography written by Clark McKinley Garber himself. Well, that is all for today. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. Goodbye.